So we've heard a lot about GMOs so far, and I'm here to refute the claim that GMOs provide sustainable advantages to over traditional agriculture. So the first point is that, or that I'm refuting, is that GMOs provide the sustainable improvements, and the second point is that they are safe for human consumption. So that they are that they provide a benefit to farmers is mainly in that that they don't require pesticides because it's sort of built in. According to the Institute for Reasonable Technology, they use a Bt toxin which is produced in the plant. And quote, the Bt toxin produced by these GM crops are far stronger than any found in nature and are produced throughout the plant. And the reason this is a problem is because the Bt toxin is produced all over the plant, including in the pollen, and that pollen spreads. And it targets non-pests such as bees and butterflies, specifically monarch butterflies, which are endangered. In addition, the weeds and insects that are meant to be killed by the GMOs are evolving more rapidly to combat the Bt toxin. National Geographic claims that the crops that continuously make Bt may hasten the evolution of insects impervious to the pesticide. And we've all had like bacterial soap, it always says kills 99.9% of bacteria. Now 1% evolves and it reproduces and you create a new generation. So in essence, we're hastening the evolution of counters to pesticides. In addition, there was a claim that the GMOs are cost efficient for farmers. Unfortunately, according to Modern Farmer, between 2001 and 2010, total on-farm herbicide use increased 26% as weed resistance grew. So they are actually spending more on herbicides. In addition, the GMO crops are more expensive than the traditionals because it's fancier. And in addition to being more expensive, the conventional crops actually yield more than GMO crops do. According to the same article from Modern Farmer, the conventional fields of corn yield 15 to 30 more bushels per acre than GMO fields, with a profit margin of up to $100 more per acre. So they're no longer as profitable than conventional crops are, and they produce less food per acre. In addition, the claim that GMOs are safe for human consumption. This is true. They have no link to any increase in cancer or organ toxicity. However, what else has no link to increase in cancer and organ toxicity is regular food. The lack of a disadvantage is not necessarily an advantage. In addition, GMOs are being updated too fast for adequate testing, according to Alison Snow, who is a researcher for IRT. And in essence, they're not being tested fast enough they're being produced faster than they can be tested, which is how you get situations like, if you're familiar with the Galaxy Note, sure, cell phones are usually safe, but the Galaxy Note explodes because it wasn't tested properly.
That's a feature.
Yeah, it's a feature. In addition, GMOs lack biodiversity by definition, because biodiversity is causing additional traits to appear, and GMOs are intended to be engineered for one specific trait. A result of this is something like the Irish potato famine. It was a result of a lack of biodiversity, and one virus was able to wipe out tons of potatoes and cause a massive famine. We're leading towards a similar situation if we reduce biodiversity. And in my opponent's claim, there was actually evidence that they said that yes, there is a lack of biodiversity, but because of what they currently have is safe for human consumption, they're not worried about it. Well, that's not very sustainable, because in the future, if there's a virus, it wipes out everything. In addition, the selected traits are potentially an over-advantage when introduced to the wild. So if you introduce a GMO, an example, say salmon, into the wild, or even by accident, the GMO traits are potentially better than wild. You end up with an invasive species that overpopulates. You create additional issues in nature, which means that they have to be heavily regulated. In conclusion, the GMOs are no longer cost efficient to farm. They are creating a future that is not sustainable by increasing the rate of pests, and they are potentially leading up to a disaster by reducing biodiversity.
That's beautiful. Oh, there's time. Oh, thank you.
Just whoever talks over the other person wants
All right, Taylor, you identify the proposition, the issues are presented, the exact claim that the advocate presented were not quite as clearly stated as they might have been. I know what the subject matters are. That's okay because you basically are arguing counterclaims on most of the supporting points. On the first point, you talk about what the dangers are there, and you mentioned the BT toxin and talk about what the complications there could be. Some of that was cited, some of it seemed like it was asserted, and then you followed up with a better piece of evidence that I think demonstrates that that is a real problem, a real issue that's going on there. So it's a good counterclaim on that particular issue. It suggests like one of these unintended consequences that we talked about, and I think that that's a good argument to make. I don't know that it addresses the exact issue that the advocate's presenting, but it does present a complicating factor in deciding whether or not they are safe to use, because there are other issues of safety that we're talking about. On the cost efficiency thing, the fact that they're using more of it more of the herbicides, for instance, I don't know that that's necessarily a cost issue. It might have to do with the amount of production that's going on. I think it's a good piece of information. I think you make the right inference from it. Like I said, I just think that there needs to be a little bit more analysis on it. Let me see. There was a the evidence that I did like, especially, was from the same source, the Modern Farmer. I think is the source citation that you're using there, that talks about how the yields are greater using traditional methods and that the return is greater using the traditional methods. And that really seems to address the key issue on this particular point. The problem here is that the advocate's making an argument that I don't remember if they had direct evidence that demonstrated this, or if they're making the argument based on the inference that they would use less of the herbicides and therefore productivity would increase. And so I think I need a little bit more contrast on this, although I think if I'm looking at the on-balance evidence, your evidence makes it simpler. And like if we were in a debate and you're summarizing at the end of the argument and you're doing a comparison, it would be easy to say, well, you have to do a lot of math and calculation to hope that the advocate is correct. Modern Farmer says it isn't, and it gives us a direct example that demonstrates that. And I think you don't have to do a lot of math in order to figure that one out. And so maybe that would be the way to make that comparison a little bit more forcefully. The safety issue, I think there is a few more assertions on this particular point. I do like the idea that says a lack of a disadvantage doesn't equal an advantage. I think that's a reasonable point to make. Their argument really seems to be a preemptive argument on the safety issue. If that was the main focus of the argument, then I think the whole thing needed to be developed a little bit more. I like the follow-up that you have suggesting, look, the turnaround time of this research is so fast, they're developing things so quickly that we can't keep up with what's going on. And then I kind of like the little analogy that you draw. It's a figurative analogy to the Galaxy phone, tab phone, whatever it is, the Galaxy. What is it? Note, Galaxy Note. I can never remember that. The Galaxy Note phones. And it said, look, there are lots of cell phones. Galaxy's had a lot of success with that, Gesundheit, a lot of success with those kinds of things, but they're rushing stuff into production because they're looking at the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, and now they've got a problem. We're going to run into the same sort of thing here. I think that that's a really interesting way of presenting this particular argument that is probably convincing, even though the evidence is not exactly the same. We can see the pattern that you're talking about there. The lack of biodiversity, I think, is an interesting point. One of the things I was wondering, though, as I'm listening to this is, if it's moving along the evolution, you say it's the negative way, but why wouldn't it be the positive way, you know? Like if you wipe out, you know, and you only got 1% of what's left is the strongest, but is it automatically the worst? Is it, you know, why wouldn't it be the best characteristics? I think there's an inference there that there's some harmful thing that's going on, and maybe that's the case, but I think you have to explain it a little bit more. I did like the idea, though, that the potentially invasive species could be problematic, and they could represent a problem to more natural species in the environment. And I think this is a good place where you might want to come back and say, and don't forget, we got bees and butterflies that are disappearing all over the place, and that illustrates the point for you even more effectively.
Haven't you seen the movie? You know it's a bad idea.